Welcome to Lit and Unfiltered by My Element, the podcast where real talk meets cannabis culture. Whether you're lighting up for wellness, relaxation, or curiosity, this is the space for raw, unfiltered conversations that go beyond the buzz. In every episode, we'll spark discussions that keep it real, give you the facts and push boundaries. No fluff, no filler. Just real talk about the cannabis revolution happening right now. So roll with us, kick back, and let's dive into another lit conversation. Proudly brought to you by My Element Electric Lighters. Make your own flame. Now to your hosts, Jax and Mia.
All right, so picture this. You're backpacking across like Europe or something, right? And you and your buddies are enjoying some local culture, decide to light up, totally fine, no problem. But then you cross a border, same scenario, and bam, you're hit with a massive fine, maybe even worse. Wild, right? Well, that's the crazy reality of cannabis laws in our world today. It's a total free-for-all, a patchwork of approaches, and it's honestly kind of baffling. So that's what we're diving into on this deep dive. Global cannabis laws. We've got stacks of research, articles, all that good stuff ready to unpack. We'll trace it all back, the history, the big moments that shape things. And then we'll really get into it, the arguments for and against legalization. You know, one thing that's always blown my mind is how drastically things changed for cannabis. I mean, we're talking 20th century, a complete 180. For centuries, it was just this plant used for medicine, textiles, everyday stuff. And then boom. Public enemy number one. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's a long story, really complex. But honestly, a lot of it comes down to, sadly, racial bias in politics.
Yeah, that's always a tough pill to swallow, but super important to acknowledge.
Totally. So early 1900s, U.S. is seeing a lot of anti-immigrant feelings. And cannabis, which was associated with Mexican immigrants, became a target. That prejudice played a huge role in the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which basically made cannabis illegal in the U.S.
So this one law really set the stage for decades of prohibition.
Exactly. And keep in mind, this U.S. policy had ripple effects globally. A lot of countries just followed suit, adopted those same prohibitionist approaches.
Wow, talk about the butterfly effect. One country's issues impacting the world.
Totally. And then, of course, came the 1970s, the war on drugs. The U.S. doubled down, passing the Controlled Substances Act. That put cannabis in, get this, Schedule 1.
Wait, Schedule 1? Like the same category as heroin.
You got it. Schedule 1, meaning high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use, which, let's be real, was more about politics than actual science. That cemented its illegal status, really fueling that global prohibition trend.
It's kind of mind-blowing, honestly, how one country's policies rooted in like such a messy history, how can that impact the whole world?
It really makes you think. But here's the thing. We're seeing a shift. There's this green wave happening globally. More and more places are rethinking their stance on cannabis.
Okay, so less butterfly effect, more like a green tsunami. There's got to be some pretty compelling arguments driving this change, right?
For sure. Three main forces, I'd say. Economics, social justice, and public health and safety.
All right, let's break it down, starting with economics. Because, let's be real, money talks.
It does. And when governments see economic potential, they listen up. Take Colorado, for example. They legalized recreational cannabis back in 2012. And they've generated, are you ready for this? Over $7 billion in tax revenue.
$7 billion? That's a whole lot of green. What are they doing with it?
It's going right back into the state.
Okay.
Education, healthcare, infrastructure. And it's not just Colorado. Globally, the legal cannabis market is booming. Projections say it'll be worth a massive $73.6 billion by 2027.
So yeah, we're talking serious economic potential. No wonder governments are interested. But what about the social justice side? That's a whole other layer to this.
It is. And for many, it's the most compelling reason to legalize. See, the war on drugs, it had devastating effects on communities of color.
Yeah, I've heard that. But I'd love to hear more. How did it disproportionately impact them?
Well, they were targeted more often, penalized more harshly for drug offenses, even for cannabis, even though usage rates were similar across racial groups.
So this system was basically rigged against them.
Pretty much. And now, with legalization, there's a push for social equity programs. It's about righting those wrongs, making sure everyone benefits from this industry.
Like in New York, right. They're really focusing on minority-owned businesses.
You got it. Creating opportunities for those who are most harmed by prohibition. It's about reinvesting in communities ravaged by the war on drugs. Funding job training, affordable housing, addiction treatment, you name it.
Like, they're trying to undo decades of damage with a more fair approach. That's pretty incredible. Okay, so we've got Economic incentives, social justice. What's the third factor driving this green wave? You mentioned public health and safety. Now that's where it gets really interesting for me.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big one. And it's a perspective that's really gaining ground these days. See, for so long, the focus was all about punishing people for using cannabis.
Yeah.
But now people are realizing that, well, prohibition hasn't really stopped anyone. If anything, it just pushed it all underground, created this whole black market that's way more dangerous.
Yeah, makes sense. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But definitely still there.
Exactly. When you're buying on the black market, who knows what you're getting? Could be laced with other stuff, grown with harmful pesticides. Legalization changes that because you have regulations and quality control.
So it's like the Wild West versus like a nice grocery store.
Totally. With legalization, you have consumer protections, which is huge. They test for potency, contaminants. It's labeled, held to some kind of standard, just like alcohol or anything else.
Yeah, it's about bringing it into the light, minimizing harm, making it safer for everyone.
Exactly. And then you can actually talk about responsible use, public education, better access to treatment for those who need it. The whole conversation becomes about health, not punishment.
Okay, I get that. But I gotta ask, what about the people who aren't on board? Because not everyone's thrilled about legalization, right?
Oh, for sure. It's not all perfect. There are some real concerns, and it's important that we address those.
So let's get into it. What are the big ones? What are people most worried about?
I'd say one of the biggest is the potential health risks, especially for young people. Their brains are still developing, so that's a real concern.
Right, like those studies about heavy use in teenagers and mental health issues later on, psychosis and things like that.
Exactly. Some studies, like there's a recent one in JAMA Psychiatry, it suggests there might be a link, especially for people who are already predisposed to those conditions. But it's complicated. More research is definitely needed, especially on those high-potency products that are everywhere now.
So yeah, caution is key, especially for young people. What about addiction? How big of a deal is that?
It's definitely a valid concern. It's not as addictive as like alcohol or opioids, but the risk is there. And again, with these high-potency products, it's not the same as it used to be.
Okay, so responsible use, understanding the risks, that's all super important. What about public safety? I feel like that's a big one for a lot of people.
It is. One of the biggest concerns there is impaired driving, which obviously is a serious issue with any substance.
For sure. Driving under the influence, no matter what it is, that's never okay.
Exactly. And because this is all so new, figuring out how to enforce DUIs with cannabis, it's still a work in progress. There are also worries about workplace safety, like you don't want your pilot or surgeon impaired just like you wouldn't want them drunk.
Right, makes sense. So it seems like we're still figuring out all the impacts, the good and the bad.
Yeah, it's a process. But it's not all about the science and public health stuff. Some people argue that legalization actually makes the black market worse.
Wait, really? I thought the whole point was to get rid of the black market.
Right, in theory. But it's tricky. California is a good example. They legalized recreational use back in 2016, but they still have a huge black market problem.
That's so interesting. Why is that happening? You'd think with legal options, people wouldn't bother with the black market.
A couple of reasons. One is taxes. A lot of states, California included, they imposed big taxes on legal cannabis to make money and regulate the industry.
So it makes it super expensive.
Exactly. And then it's hard for legal businesses to compete with the black market because those guys don't pay taxes.
Right, they can undercut the legal market, but it can't just be the taxes, right?
Nope, there's more. Regulations, which are important for safety, but they can be a lot for businesses to deal with, especially small ones.
So it's like finding that balance. You want rules, but not so many that it pushes people back to the black market.
Exactly. And then there's this whole other layer, corporate cannabis taking over.
Okay, tell me more about that. What's the problem with big corporations getting involved? Isn't that how a lot of industries work?
It is. But for a lot of folks who fought for legalization, the goal was to help small businesses, not to have big tobacco 2.0.
So it's about making sure everyone benefits, not just the big guys.
Exactly. Finding that balance, a regulated market that protects people but doesn't crush small businesses or give huge corporations all the power. It's about fairness. To really get it, we got to look at what other countries are doing.
Okay, let's do it. Let's take a trip around the world, see how different countries are handling this whole green wave. How about we start with Canada? They were kind of pioneers in legalizing recreational cannabis.
They were. Back in 2018, they took the leap, became the first major Western nation to fully legalize it.
It was a big deal. So how's it been going for them? Total reefer madness or, have they made it work?
It's been an adjustment, definitely, But honestly, it seems to be working out pretty well. They went all in on regulation, strict rules on everything. Distribution, marketing, packaging.
So like a very controlled approach. Safety first.
Exactly. But here's the interesting thing. They also allow people to grow their own.
Wait, seriously, Canadians can just, like, have a few plants at home?
Yep. Up to 4 plants per household for personal use, though each province can tweak the rules a bit.
Wow, that's pretty progressive. So it's not just about the big companies. They're thinking about individual rights, too.
Right. Giving people options is important.
Love that. Okay, so what about Uruguay? They were way ahead of the curve on this, weren't they?
They were. 2013, they did it. First country in the world to fully legalize cannabis.
2013, that feels like a million years ago in cannabis years. What's their system like? I bet it's different from Canada.
It is. Get this, they sell it in pharmacies.
Pharmacies, seriously, like you're picking up a prescription and some weed.
Pretty much. It's part of their whole approach, treating it like any other regulated substance. They've also got cannabis clubs and home cultivation, so lots of options to access it legally.
Interesting.
Right.
Trying to normalize it, make it just part of life. But I imagine it hasn't been all smooth sailing.
You're right. They've had some issues, supply shortages mainly. And the black market's still a thing, which happens a lot when legal supply can't keep up.
Right, makes sense. If people can't get it legally, they'll find it somewhere else. It's a good reminder that even with good intentions, the details matter. But it's cool to see these countries experimenting, learning from each other.
It really is. Okay, we can't talk global cannabis laws without talking about, well, the United States.
Right, talk about a mixed bag. Federally illegal, but then all these states are legalizing. It's kind of confusing.
It's a prime example of that federal-state power struggle. You've got states like California, Colorado, Washington. They've gone full-on legal, making money, creating jobs, the whole 9 yards.
But it's still this weird limbo because the feds are like, nope, still illegal.
Exactly. And that causes all these headaches for those states. Banking issues, interstate commerce, the list goes on.
Right, like even if I'm traveling from one legal state to another, I could still get in trouble.
Yep. Crossing state lines with cannabis, even if you're going from one legal state to another, it's still a federal offense. And then there's banking. Because it's federally illegal, banks are terrified to work with these businesses. They don't want to get in trouble with the feds.
So these businesses are like being punished even though they're following state laws?
Pretty much. It's a huge obstacle for them.
Yeah.
There have been some attempts to change things, like the Safe Banking Act. It's been introduced in Congress a bunch of times.
Right, the Safe Banking Act. Okay, for those of us who aren't lawyers, what does that even mean?
Basically, it would protect banks that work with cannabis businesses, so they wouldn't get penalized by the feds just for doing business with them.
So making it easier for these businesses to actually function.
Exactly. But even though there's support for it, it hasn't gone anywhere in Congress. Shows you how tricky this whole thing is.
It's like the U.S. is trying to walk and chew gum at the same time. Public opinion's changing, states are doing their thing, but the feds are stuck. It's a mess.
For sure. But it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. Let's hop over to the Netherlands, a country practically famous for its connection to cannabis.
The Netherlands, coffee shops, tulips, the works. But isn't it all kind of a gray area legally?
Totally. It's a great example of decriminalization. So it's not technically legal, but they don't really go after people for personal use or possession. They're all about harm reduction. Their thinking is, people are going to do it anyway, so let's make it as safe as possible.
So more about being practical than being super strict.
Exactly. And they've been doing it this way for decades, hence the whole coffee shop thing.
It's part of their culture at this point.
Totally. But it's not full-on legalization. They're cool with you using it, buying it in coffee shops, but growing it and supplying it, that's always been in a weird legal zone.
So where does all the cannabis in those coffee shops even come from?
That's the million-dollar question. It's mostly from the black market, which obviously causes problems. They've tried different things, like the weed pass system, and recently they've been testing out a program for legal production.
So they're dipping their toes in the legal water, seeing if they can square that with their more tolerant approach.
Exactly. It's a work in progress. But it shows there's no right answer. Every country's figuring it out as they go.
It's a lot. History, arguments, what other countries are doing. We covered a lot of ground.
We did. And the big takeaway is the world's view on cannabis, it's changing. Those old school ideas about prohibition, they're fading out. People are realizing there might be benefits, but there are definitely concerns. Finding that middle ground, that's the challenge.
For sure. But this green wave, it's not slowing down anytime soon.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And like with any big, complicated issue, we got to stay informed, talk to each other, and stand up for what we believe in.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, the future of cannabis, it affects all of us. So keep learning, be curious, and we'll see what happens next.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Lit and Unfiltered by My Element. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation and picked up some fresh insights on cannabis culture. Also, don't forget to check out myelement.store for our full range of electric lighters and accessories, designed with style, sustainability, and free lifetime replacement in mind. Still here? Cool. Here's an exclusive heads up just for our listeners. We've got a flash sale coming soon with over 50% off select lighters as well as some wild giveaways. You won't want to miss it. Head over to myelement.store. Join the crew and keep an eye on your inbox for the details. Until next time, keep it lit. My Element. Make your own flame.